Good afternoon. I'm Sylvester Johnson, Director of the Center for Humanities at Virginia Tech, and I want to thank you for joining our Humanities Faculty Research Colloquium. I want to recognize Joe Fort, who directs the Athenaeum, the digital hub at Virginia Tech, and Dominique Francesca, the business manager for the Center for Humanities, for their work in making this event possible. And a quick announcement that on Monday, April the 11th, at this same time, Professor Marian Mullen will present her work on Ida Ford and the Spirit of Social Change. Today, we are joined by Professor Philip Yaure. Dr. Philip Yaure is an assistant professor of philosophy. His work in social and political philosophy and anti-racist critical theory address topics including citizenship, political judgment and expertise, resistance, and the nature of political community. He engages with these topics through the history of Black American political thought, and he focuses particularly on the antebellum period. Professor Yaure's focus is also in the history of early modern philosophy and ethics. In early modern philosophy, he examines the role of humility in the epistemologies of 17th century philosophers, including John Locke and Margaret Cavendish. In ethics, he critically examines the role of legal concepts in our moral practices, such as the idea that one needs proper standing to blame a wrongdoer. Today, he's sharing his research entitled Seizing Citizenship, Frederick Douglass's Abolitionist Republicanism. I want to remind our audience that we will invite your questions and your comments about halfway through our program, but you're welcome to send us your comments and questions at any time. You can simply click that Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window, and that will queue it up for us. And we will look forward to having that feedback from you. So without further ado, welcome, Professor Philip Yaure.
Thanks so much, Sylvester. I really appreciate the introduction. And I'd like to thank the Center for Humanities for their support of my research this academic year. I've been really excited to get this opportunity to share my current book project with you all. So I will just share my screen. And great. So as Sylvester said, I'm going to be presenting today on my current book project, Seizing Citizenship, Frederick Douglass's Abolitionist Republicanism. So in this project, I examined the idea of citizenship that I argued Douglas develops in his political thought, starting in the 1850s, but spans through the postbellum period as well. Douglas, I argue, develops a radically inclusive idea of what it means to be a member of a political community, that is, to be a citizen. For Douglas, citizenship is fundamentally something that we do, rather than a status that is given to us by others. This idea of citizenship implies that it's in the power of marginalized peoples to seize the rights and recognition of citizenship through collective resistance against oppression. Achieving emancipation, or freedom from oppression, is not, on Douglas's account, a matter of persuading the privileged and powerful to share their power. Rather, emancipatory politics for Douglas is about organizing and acting to take power for ourselves. So first, just a brief biography of Douglas. He was born in 1818 into slavery in Eastern Maryland. He was raised for the first years of his life by his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, until he was forced to work on the plantation of the Alds. In a daring and meticulously organized escape effort in 1838, Douglas escapes to New York and eventually settles in Massachusetts, where he reunites with his wife, Anna Murray Douglas, who was born free and played an integral role in his successful escape from slavery. In Massachusetts, Douglas gets involved with the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison in the late 1830s and continues his involvement with Garrison through the 1840s. With Garrison, Douglas gives anti-slavery lectures about his own life to audiences all across the Northeast and Midwest. But by the late 1840s or early 1850s, you could draw the line in different places, Douglas breaks with Garrison over the question of anti-slavery strategy. Whereas Garrison thinks that the only effective means for combating slavery is moral suasion, that is, giving moral and religious arguments to persuade people that slavery is wrong, Douglas comes to think that a viable anti-slavery movement needs to make sense of American political institutions and values. During the Civil War, Douglas serves as an active recruiter for Black Union Army units. And after the Civil War, he serves a variety of roles, including as president of the Freeman Savings Bank, on a commission to Santo Domingo that considers annexation of the Dominican Republic by the US. He served as a vice presidential nominee on the Equal Rights Party ticket and as consul general to Haiti. He died suddenly from a heart attack in 1895 at the age of 77. My point of departure in this book project focuses on the anti-slavery strategy that Douglas adopts when he breaks with William Lloyd Garrison, which scholars typically label political abolitionism. Political abolitionists like Douglas thought that the anti-slavery movement ought to use American political institutions and values, in other words, to deploy the coercive powers of the state to combat slavery and white supremacy. Political abolitionism contrasts with two other anti-slavery strategies prevalent in the 1850s, moral suasionism and separatism. Moral suasionists sought to combat slavery and white supremacy through argument, to persuade white Americans that slavery and white supremacy were wrong. Moral suasionists refused to make use of tactics that involved power and coercion. They were generally committed to nonviolence on principle and believed that the political power of the American state could only reinforce and not undermine slavery and white supremacy. Separatists, on the other hand, sought to create sovereign political communities for Black people in the US that were beyond the reach of the American polity. These strategies typically involved calling for Black Americans to emigrate beyond the borders of the US, to join or found a separate polity. Under the banner of separatism, we can include both Black nationalist projects, like those of the emigrationist projects of Martin Delany, as well as white-led colonization projects. Political abolitionism, as a third option, other than moral suasion and separatism, conceives of the project of emancipation as taking hold of American political institutions and values, as I've said. And one key element of political abolition, one of its key planks, so to speak, is the assertion that Douglas makes throughout the 1850s that enslaved and nominally free Black people in the US were already American citizens, whom the polity ought to acknowledge as such. For instance, in an 1853 speech, The Claims of Our Common Cause, Douglas states, "We declare that we are, and of right we ought to be, American citizens." Now, it's worth keeping in mind that with declarations like this, Douglas implies that he's thinking of emancipation as taking a particular shape. His is a project that aims to make an oppressive polity more inclusive. That is, Douglas's goal is to bring those who have been excluded, marginalized, and exploited by a polity into its fold as full citizens. Not all emancipatory projects take this form, of course. Many anti-colonial struggles, for instance, involve breaking with, rather than seeking greater integration into the metropole or the colonial power. Although there's some really interesting work by Kevin Duong in APSR recently that challenges this sort of straightforward way of thinking of all anti-colonial struggles as trying to engage in a kind of separation. But one of Douglas's key insights, the one that I explore in this project, is that emancipatory projects which do aim at inclusion, part of what they require is a reimagining of what it means to be a member of the polity. This is what Douglas is doing when he declares that Black Americans in the 1850s are already American citizens, whom the polity ought to acknowledge as such. So the question I take up in the project is, what can Douglas possibly mean by the term citizen here, such that a people exploited by centuries of slavery, codified and legalized forms of violence, and even explicit legal decisions stating that they are not citizens, like the Dred Scott decision, how could they count as American citizens for Douglas? What does he mean when he says, "We declare that we are and of right to be American citizens"? So my answer to this question, the main thesis of the book, is that when Douglas says that Black Americans are already American citizens, he's thinking of citizenship in terms of contribution. Now, I know that I have some philosophers in the audience, so I have a semi-formalized definition on the slide here, but here's what it says in ordinary English for the rest of us. A person is a member of a polity if and only if she contributes to that polity by shaping its normative foundation. Or in other words, what it is to be a citizen on Douglas's view is to act in ways that help to determine what the polity values. In thinking of citizenship in these terms, Douglas embeds himself in the Republican tradition of political thought, on which the citizen is someone who participates in the political life of the polity. Now, what I think is distinctive about Douglas's conception of Republican citizenship is that he gives us a deeply capacious understanding of what counts as a contribution to the polity, or what counts as participating in the polity's political life. As we'll see, both grand and quotidian forms of anti-slavery resistance, and indeed many forms of quotidian social interaction more generally, shape a community's normative foundation, what the community values, such that one can be a citizen by engaging in these many different types of activity for Douglas. Douglas's conception of Republican citizenship is thus radically inclusive and pluralistic. Many different kinds of activity count as contributing to the polity. But it's also a demanding conception of citizenship, in the sense that we have to do something in order to become citizens. Now, Aristotle famously observed that the word being is said in many ways. The same point applies to citizenship. We use the word citizen to refer to a number of different ideas. In general, citizenship is a status that persons possess. We make claims on a particular political community because we possess the status. The example that comes to mind is from the film Babel at the moment, when I was writing up these notes. This was at the PPE Cinema from last week is why it came to mind. That Kate Blanchett's character in the film, after she's accidentally shot, she and her husband call in the American embassy to come and try to rescue them. They don't call in the French embassy or in the Thai embassy. They call in the American embassy because they're American citizens and take themselves to have a claim on that particular polity to assist them in these circumstances. So again, it's this idea citizens are those who can lay claim on a particular polity. But there's many different ways of explaining why someone can make claims on a particular political community. Often we say that someone is a citizen because the state conferred this status of citizenship upon her, say through a process of naturalization. We also sometimes think of citizenship as being conferred when the state confers rights on persons. So for instance, we say that when someone is denied her right to vote, she's denied her citizenship. And many also would say that citizenship, in a sense, can be connected to a national identity or an ethos or a culture that one participates in, or because of something like birthright, because she was born in a particular polity. In contrast to all of these other varieties of citizenship, these different grounds of being a citizen, the Republican concept says that one is a citizen because she participates in the public life of the polity. We find this statement in a variety of Republican political thinkers throughout the history of Western political thought. So, for instance, Aristotle in the Politics states that the citizen is one who shares or participates in the administration of justice and the holding of office. Or Rousseau in the Social Contract describes the citizen as one who shares or participates in the sovereign power of a polity. And this is a thought that even applies to contemporary political philosophers like Joseph Cairns, who might not explicitly style themselves as Republicans. Cairns characterizes citizens as people who live and work and raise their families in a society. The important point here is that for all three of these thinkers, and for Republicans generally, it's not that one has a right to participate in, as Aristotle puts it, the administration of justice in a polity because one is a citizen. Rather, one is a citizen because she participates in the administration of justice or the political life of the polity. So, on the Republican concept of citizenship, we are citizens of a polity because we participate in its public life. Participation is valuable because when we participate in the public life of the polity, we contribute to that polity. As Kimlicka and Norman put it in a classic article on citizenship, in the Republican tradition, political participation is defined as activity that is desirable for the polity. In other words, to act in ways that contribute to the public or the common good. Thus, what is distinctive about the Republican conception of citizenship is that it is a status that derives from the activity of persons. It is what we do that makes us citizens. Republican citizenship is not a status that's conferred by a state or any other group of people. Rather, it's in the power of each of us, often acting in concert with others, to seize citizenship for ourselves by participating in the public life of the polity, attempting to contribute to its common good. However, the concept of Republican citizenship traditionally conceived has a bad rap, and perhaps for a good reason. Traditional formulations of Republican citizenship severely restrict what kinds of activity count as participating in the public life of the polity, and they thereby deeply restrict who is actually in a position to make themselves citizens. Traditionally, Republicans hold that activities like holding political office, serving in the military, and participating in deliberation on law and policy count as the kinds of roles through which persons contribute to the polity and thereby make themselves citizens. That is to say, Republicans traditionally conceive of the public sphere very narrowly, with very limited avenues for participation. Political philosophers and theorists have long recognized that this traditional formulation of Republican citizenship tends towards exclusion. There's at least three different critiques that we can identify among political philosophers and theorists on this point. So Benjamin Constant, in his essay on the liberty of the ancients and of the moderns, points out that modern polities are just too big for everyone to participate in the public sphere, narrowly defined. Not everyone can hold political office. But contemporary critics of republicanism have pushed even further. So some have argued that freedom is built into the very idea of participation in the Republican tradition, in the sense that one must already be free or independent in order to contribute to the polity as a citizen. The forms of political participation, these critics argue, that traditionally Republicans require, they demand things like material security to take care of one's self and to help sustain the polity. They require robust forms of education so that one can make the proper sorts of judgments in deliberation. And they require the cultivation of civic virtue in order to sacrifice one's interests for the greater good. We might think that these are conditions that don't come for free or automatically to persons. And so this ends up being a highly restrictive barrier for those who are even in a position to participate in the polity as citizens. And other contemporary theorists have observed that the labor of some must be exploited in order for others to participate in the public sphere, traditionally and narrowly conceived by Republicans. So take, for instance, the propertied males of Athens, who were able to deliberate for hours in the assembly and thereby make themselves citizens from a Republican perspective. They were only able to do this because of the social reproductive work performed by women and slaves. But the social reproductive work was not valued as a citizenship constituting contribution to the polity. It was not recognized as a way of participating in the polity's public life. In light of these criticisms, it may seem surprising that Douglas draws on the Republican concept of citizenship to serve as the foundation of his political abolitionism. The Republican idea of citizenship for centuries has justified the exclusion and marginalization of subordinated and exploited groups. Yet, Douglas is able to see emancipatory potential in the Republican concept of citizenship because he rejects the traditional narrow understanding of what counts as a contribution to the polity. When Douglas asserts that enslaved and nominally free Black Americans are American citizens, what he is asserting is that Black Americans contribute to the polity as citizens. This is reflected, for instance, in his 1851 speech, "The Free Negro's Place is in America." Douglas states, "I believe that simultaneously with the landing of the Pilgrims, there landed on the shores of this continent and there landed slaves on the shores of this continent, and that for 230 years and more, we have had a foothold on this continent. We have grown up with you. We have watered your soil with our tears, nourished it with our blood, tilled it with our hands. We have leveled your forests. Our hands removed the stumps from your fields. and raised the first crops and brought the first produce to your tables. We have been with you and are still with you, have been with you in adversity, and by the help of God will be with you in prosperity. We have fought for this country. We are American citizens. Part of what Douglas is saying in passages like this is that people can act in ways that contribute to the polity as citizens without already being free. In other passages where Douglas asserts that enslaved and nominally free Black people in the US are American citizens, he claims that their resistance against slavery and white supremacy are ways in which they contribute to the polity as citizens. For example, in his 1853 speech that I referenced earlier, The Claims of Our Common Cause, Douglas states that resistance against tyranny is obedience to God, and that Black Americans are citizens by the principles of the Declaration of Independence. What Douglas is asserting in these passages is that Black Americans constitute themselves as citizens by resisting slavery and white supremacy, because in so doing, they enact values encoded in the Declaration of Independence. By enacting these values, they participate in the public life of the polity. Thus, Douglas formulates a position in the Republican political tradition that I call abolitionist republicanism. For Douglas, the free citizen is forged through struggle against tyranny and oppression. One struggle to become free is itself a contribution to the polity on Douglas's conception. Becoming free and becoming a citizen are, Douglas, things that happen together and at once. So at this point, it's clear that resistance against slavery and white supremacy count as contributions to the American polity on Douglas's view. The question at this stage is, why is it that such resistance counts as a citizenship constituting contribution? Now, I think there's two broad ways of approaching this question, which I've labeled on the slide as the narrow strategy and the wide strategy. The answer, according to the narrow strategy, is that the American polity already values such resistance against tyranny and oppression. This seems to be Douglas's view in his famous 1852 speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, as well as in his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, when he likens the resistance of enslaved Black Americans to that of American revolutionaries. On the narrow strategy, anti-slavery resistance counts as a contribution to the polity because it enacts a principle that the polity already values, a commitment to resist tyranny and oppression. Now, one major limitation of this narrow interpretive strategy is that it is contingent whether a given polity in fact values this commitment to resist tyranny and oppression. Some polities will value this commitment and others will not. Indeed, it would be very reasonable to doubt that the US in 1850 could be said to value the commitment to resist tyranny and oppression. At a minimum, it seems that Douglas, in order to think this, would have to be committed to a form of American exceptionalism. To think that the US was a polity special in the sense that it really did happen to value resistance against tyranny and oppression. I admit that this used to be the interpretation of Douglas that I held. Indeed, I argued for this interpretation as part of the job talk that I gave for my current position here in the philosophy department. At the time, I was willing to bite the bullet and say that Douglas was in some sense an American exceptionalist. And at the time, this struck me as a potential critique of his view. But as I've developed this book project, I've come to a different interpretation, which doesn't require that we read Douglas as an American exceptionalist. On the wide strategy, the interpretation that I now hold, resistance counts as a contribution to the polity because it is a type of activity that contests and shapes what the polity values. On the wide interpretation, we don't need to ascribe any fixed set of values to the polity. The citizen is not someone who enacts what the polity already values. The citizen is someone who articulates a vision of what the polity should value. The key to adopting this wide interpretive strategy, I think, comes in the closing paragraphs of this 1852 speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. In many excerpts of the speech, they tend to focus on what are characterized as the two halves of the speech. On the one hand, as a sort of lauding of the American Republic that then turns to a condemnation of it in the second half. But these two halves are really only 2/3 of the speech. There's a shift after the moment of condemnation in the speech. There's a turn towards a note of hopefulness in its closing paragraphs, which is embodied, for instance, in Douglas's characterization of constitutional interpretation. Douglas characterizes constitutional interpretation as a paradigmatic way of contributing to the polity as a citizen. He states, "I hold that every American citizen has a right to form an opinion of the Constitution and to propagate that opinion, and to use all honorable means to make his opinion the prevailing one." What Douglas means when he says that citizens have a right to form an opinion of the Constitution is that it is in the power of people to formulate such an opinion. And when they do, they make themselves citizens. Crucially for Douglas, constitutional interpretation is in the power of all citizens, not a specialized set of experts. Douglas isn't thinking here of constitutional interpretation as the province of constitutional lawyers, for instance. He states that constitutional interpretation involves plain common sense rules such that you and I and all of us can understand and apply without having passed years in the study of law. What Douglas means by constitutional interpretation is activity through which we articulate a vision of what the polity should value. When we do this, we contest or shape the polity's normative foundation. I shape what our community values by articulating visions of what I think it should value. When I do this, I act as a citizen in Douglas's Republican sense. The radically inclusive power of Douglas's conception of Republican citizenship ultimately derives from his deeply capacious understanding of what kind of activity counts as constitutional interpretation. In particular, Douglas holds that anti-slavery resistance counts as constitutional interpretation, and that this is because such resistance has the power to contest and shape what the polity values. Anti-slavery resistance shapes what the polity values in two ways. On the one hand, through action in concert or collaboration, and on the other hand, through confrontation. What I'll do to conclude the talk is spell out exactly how these two dimensions of anti-slavery resistance work to constitute enslaved Black Americans as American citizens. One assumption that it's worth noting is that Douglas, in his account, assumes that resistance against slavery is ubiquitous among enslaved Black Americans. His autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, paints a picture of the plantation as a site suffused with resistance. What makes Douglas's assumption plausible, I think, is that he's thinking not only of grand acts of resistance like revolt, but also everyday forms of mutual care and support. So let me illustrate this with a couple of examples. One way in which anti-slavery resistance shapes what the polity values and thereby constitutes those who resist as citizens is collaboration or action in concert. Anti-slavery resistance often involved collective action, Douglas shows. Douglas illustrates this point in his autobiography with a Sabbath school that he helped to organize, in which slaves covertly taught one another to read scripture. Key participants in the Sabbath school, including Douglas, went on to plan an ultimately unsuccessful attempt to escape slavery, as the next episode in the autobiography that he describes. The pivotal episode in Douglas's account of the Sabbath school, for our purposes, is the moment in which Douglas describes the deep forms of commitment forged among its participants. He writes, "I never loved, esteemed, or confided in men more than I did these. They were true as steel, and no band of brothers could have been more loving. We never undertook to do anything of any importance which was likely to affect each other without mutual consultation. We were generally a unit and moved together. Thoughts and sentiments were exchanged between us which might very well be called incendiary by oppressors and tyrants. Douglas here is describing the ways in which sustained collective action generates commitments among those who act together. Some of these commitments are open-ended mutual obligations, like those of trust, loyalty, or solidarity. They generate expectations between the parties, although those expectations are nebulous or defined in particular contexts. Other things that are generated by the shared collective action take the form of shared values, like the commitment to resist tyranny and oppression. The sentiments that are very incendiary to oppressors and tyrants in the passage. What Action in Concert does on Douglas's account is articulate a vision of how members of the wider polity should relate to one another, what they owe one another, and what values they should share and pursue as a unit. Whereas Action in Concert articulates a positive vision of how members of a polity should relate and what they should value, Confrontation contests values that members of the polity already hold. Anti-slavery resistance, Douglas shows, confronts the injustice and exploitation of the slave system. Grand forms of resistance like rebellion do this, of course, but Douglas also has in mind more quotidian or more localized forms of confrontation. Douglas, for example, describes acts that he labels appeals, in which enslaved persons contest their maltreatment, for instance, by appealing to a slaveholder about the violent acts of an overseer. He describes these acts in the following way. When a slave has nerve enough to protest or appeal, and boldly approaches his master with a well-founded complaint against an overseer, though he may be repulsed, and may even have that of which he complains repeated at the time, and though he may be beaten by his master as well as the overseer for his termity, in the end, the policy of complaining is generally vindicated by the relaxed rigor of the overseer's treatment. The latter becomes more careful and less disposed to use the lash upon slaves thereafter. It is with this final result in view, rather than with any expectation of immediate good, that the outraged slave is induced to meet his master with a complaint. Now, I think we can distinguish the empirical claim here that Douglas suggests that this form of intervention was sometimes effective for enslaved people from the intention or the goal that is embodied in this act of resistance. When we're focusing on the intention or the goal that these acts of resistance are directed towards, we see that what's going on is that enslaved people manifest their moral standing to oppressors through resistance. These acts are ways of asserting that one matters in the face of practices that deny one's moral standing and worth. Here then is the idea of citizenship that Douglas invokes when he asserts throughout the 1850s that enslaved Black Americans are already American citizens. To be a citizen is to contribute to the polity. One contributes to the polity by acting in ways that shape what the polity values. Crucially, what makes me a citizen on Douglas's account is not that my normative vision wins out, that I've already succeeded in imposing my vision of what the polity should value on others. Rather, what makes me a citizen, the way in which I contribute to the polity, is the fact that I participate in a collective, dynamic process of constantly deciding and redeciding what the community values. Political participation, including anti-slavery resistance, shapes what the polity values in two ways. Through, on the one hand, action in concert, in which shared commitments are forged that represent a positive vision of what the community should value, and on the other hand, confrontation, through which one asserts one's moral worth in the face of its denial. Douglas's account reflects the intuitive point that political activity is typically both collaborative and adversarial at the same time. Douglas doesn't privilege collaboration or confrontation as the true or ideal form of political participation. Rather, both are integral elements of how we engage in political life. Now, I do want to mention one consequence of Douglas's view, that, as I've said a couple of times, Douglas's conception of Republican citizenship is radically inclusive. Now, we might think inclusion that this is definitely going to be a good thing, but I think that in fact, this idea of radical inclusion could cut either way. So remember that for Douglas, any sustained effort to shape what the polity values counts as a contribution. This implies that those who espouse and seek to enact oppressive or exclusionary normative visions are citizens in virtue of the fact that they articulate and seek to enact these oppressive or exclusionary normative visions. So to be provocative, on Douglas's account, he would see the actions of those, for instance, involved in the January 6th insurrection as ways in which persons can port themselves as Republican citizens. And I think this might give us pause, that Douglas isn't able to, it seems, distinguish between the kinds of contributions that we might value and those that we might condemn. But ultimately, I think that Douglas's conception of citizenship isn't politically neutral. It's not neutral with respect to emancipatory aims. Because Douglas thinks that any sustained effort to shape what the polity values counts as a contribution, he thinks that whatever we do to contribute to the polity constitutes us as citizens. What others do or seek to enact, another's exclusionary vision of the polity, cannot annul the fact that I am engaging in contribution, that I am articulating my own vision of what the polity should value. So in this way, Douglas's conception of citizenship tends towards expanding the polity. For better or for worse in this sense, Douglas's conception of Republican citizenship is radically inclusive. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That is a great presentation that raises some really fascinating questions about something that's very important. And we will start with a question from one of our audience members that asks, does Douglas's adherence to the principle of natural rights as applying to everyone, including enslaved persons, contribute to his position on citizenship?
So Douglas, throughout his writings in the 1850s and indeed prior, makes appeals to natural rights theory, we can say. He says that all persons are endowed with natural rights, and in virtue of this, forms of oppression and exploitation, like slavery, are necessarily wrong, and that persons have a claim to membership in a polity. The way that I think about this is that there's two different strands, at least two different strands of Douglas's thought. Douglas sometimes argues that Black Americans are American citizens on the basis of this natural rights claim. Other times he argues, and I'm teasing out the Republican strand of his thought. Now, we might ask, it seems like the natural rights theory sort of argument is pretty straightforward. If one has a natural right to life, liberty, and happiness, for instance, that seems like a pretty strong argument against forms of oppression like slavery and white supremacy and a claim to citizenship. So why would Douglas also develop this Republican conception? Well, I think this goes back to part of what I was trying to bring out about these different conceptions of citizenship at the beginning of the talk. When we think of citizenship on this natural rights model, the idea is that I ought to be conferred citizenship because I possess these natural rights. It's a way of trying to persuade others to give me a status. By contrast, Douglas sometimes thinks that it's more useful to say that one is already a citizen in this Republican sense and ought to be acknowledged as such. So it sort of depends, I think, on the particular political context in which Douglas is situated. Sometimes he thinks it is useful to argue that citizenship should be conferred. And I think that's when he draws on this natural rights apparatus. Other times, I think for Douglas, it's really important for him to say that persons are already citizens, not to be acknowledged as such. And then I think he's drawing this Republican apparatus. So he thinks about both, but he uses them in different contexts, I think. But great question.
Yeah, it is a great question. Another question that this raises is the significance of what you raised early in your discussion, that this understanding of belonging to the political community that Douglas embraces and leverages is tied to something that the individual has to do. And so I'm wondering if you could just elaborate on the advantages and disadvantages of this idea and this approach to political belonging for highly vulnerable populations. And of course, you've you've mapped for us the context here of a slaveocracy in which he's making these claims. But anyhow, I can start there, and there are also some other questions that might follow, but we can start with that.
So I think that this is one key potential limitation of Douglas's approach of thinking of citizenship in terms of an activity that people do. So, I mean, this is connected to why the traditional conception of Republican citizenship gets this bad rap for a good reason, that the ways in which this idea of citizenship as activity is demanding seems to marginalize and exclude precisely the groups in a polity that we would, in an emancipatory politics, seek to include more fully. And so we might worry that, well, if this is a demanding conception of citizenship in the sense that it imposes barriers on, it imposes barriers on what people need to do in order to participate, we might think that it's just not going to be very effective for inclusionary purposes. I think the thing that's in the back of Douglas's mind, though, and this comes out in the ways that he describes anti-slavery resistance in the plantation, is that there are, in fact, many forms of activity that people engage in everyday ways with one another. So he, on the one hand, so he'll think of things like acts of mutual care and resistance. I tried to illustrate a couple in the talk, this idea of the Sabbath school, of teaching one another how to read. So education is one kind of activity, these activities of appeal. He also, I think maybe one of the most powerful moments is when Douglas, early on in his autobiography, and I focus on his second autobiography, My Bondage, My Freedom, that he writes in 1855, where Douglas talks about an experience that he has as a child. His mother was enslaved on a different plantation, and one night she moves covertly to visit Douglas on his plantation, takes great risk in doing so, and discovers that Douglas hasn't been fed by the plantation cook. And his mother moves to both condemn the cook and to get Douglas some food to eat. And Douglas says first that it was in that moment that he realized, or he felt, that he was somebody's child. And second, he describes this as an instructive moment. So I think it's instructive for Douglas's episode in the sense that he thinks that, on the one hand, in order to belong as a member of a community, sort of like belonging to a member of a family, being somebody's child, requires the exercise of agency. But on the other hand, he does seem to think that we do have these powers to exercise agency, and that even in radically oppressive circumstances in which many more robust or demanding forms of political agency are denied to persons, there are tools and forms of activity that they can exercise and engage in. And so for Douglas, I think that's a key part of the story for why he thinks that even though his conception of citizenship is demanding in one sense, we have to do things. He thinks that it is in fact, everyone's power to do so. Now, I do think that we can point to marginal cases where that's not the case, but I think that part of the value of thinking about citizenship as an activity is that it captures the way in which, when we forge or reshape political communities, we make some kind of accomplishment. It's an achievement when, for instance, we organize a union, for instance. And I think that Douglas's emphasis on the ways in which political agency forges political community gives us a really compelling story for that.
Oh, great. A few more questions here. So one that is expressing appreciation for the talk, and I'll try to summarize this. So your discussion of Douglas's notion of citizenship is, of course, foregrounding this point of contribution. And so assuming that citizenship is granted only for positive good contributions, in the case of slavery and resistance to oppression, this might be straightforward, but people can contribute to society in ways that produce more exclusive outcomes, right? And so the first point of this question is does Douglas have a normative background that allows him to be able to identify what counts as a positive contribution? Secondly, what happens if the concept of citizenship seems to assume there's some continuous moral progress, but whenever citizens contribute in ways that make society more parochial, more tribal, less inclusive, they lose their citizenship if you use a certain approach to this, a framework, and this would seem to be a very fragile notion of citizenship. So can you elaborate on those points? Does Douglas have a normative framework for assessing what counts as positive? And would you judge this framework to extend to negative contributions? And what happens if the contributions are actually creating a more exclusive society? And we have lots of examples globally in the US and beyond of those kinds of contributions, which is, of course, why you're doing this research.
Thanks for the question, Michael. I think this connects in part to what I was touching on in that last slide about radical inclusion. So I don't think it's the case, and I think this is a fair question because I used to think what you suggest in the first part of the question, that for Douglas, there's only certain kinds of things, we could call them positive contributions, that count as the real kind of contributions that make you a citizen. And I think for some of the reasons that you're gesturing at in your question, Michael, that kind of account doesn't work. I think that for Douglas, anything that contests or shapes the values of the polity are going to count as contributions, be they from a particular normative perspective, positive or good or negative or unjust. So I think that part of what's at issue for Douglas is why would we, or for us in interpreting Douglas, is why would we want to adopt this story on which, well, it's whatever that I do that seeks to articulate a vision of what the polity should value, that makes me a citizen, because that's going to let in lots of different kinds of oppressive or frankly even violent or marginalizing activities as contributions. And ultimately, I think the move for Douglas is to say that if we think that anything goes as a contribution, to speak a little too broadly, that there's going to be this inevitably expansionist or expansive conception of who lays claim to membership in the polity. So on the one hand, my negative or contributions in Michael's terminology make me a citizen, but my negative contributions can't annul the activity of another person to contribute them. That constitute them as a citizen. So on the one hand, part of what I think is going on in Douglas's account is that we get this inclusion by inflation kind of account. Whoever engages in a particular, participates in the public life of the polity, constitutes themselves as a citizen, others can't take that power away from them. This also ties back to Sylvester's question, this thought that for Douglas, we possess and cannot, in many cases, lose the kind of political agency necessary to contribute to the polity. Now, I think one kind of concern, and this is what I'm exploring in like the last third, the critical arm of the book project, is some of the drawbacks or some of the worries we might have about this expansionist conception of political community. I think this connects in part to Douglas's support for various US expansionist policies in the postbellum period. So the most famous one of these is, I mentioned that Douglas served on this commission to Santo Domingo, to the Dominican Republic in the early 1870s. What he's doing on that commission is supporting US efforts to annex the Dominican Republic. And I argue in one of the chapters of this book project that the reason that Douglas comes to support this, what we might characterize as US imperialist policy, is driven by his Republican conception of citizenship. He thinks that to continue the revolution at home during Reconstruction, so to speak, that it's necessary to continue to incorporate more people into the polity, to continue to reshape its normative foundation. So I think one kind of worry for Douglas, so we could say it's not just positive contributions, any kind of activity that contributes to the polity makes one a citizen. But one of the worries about that is that it seems to like embed Douglas in these US imperialist or expansionist policies in the postbellum period. And so one question that I'm still figuring out in the final chapter of the book is, can we extricate these inclusionary and these expansionist elements of Douglas' political thought? I'm not sure if we can.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we have a couple more questions that we will have time for. One is again showing gratitude for the presentation, and is pointing to the issue of characterizing Douglas's constitutional arguments. So the question is, when you refer to how Douglas directly shaped the community's values, would you please comment on whether you view those activities as legal, significant, and transformative, and or as operating beyond the realm of the law, for example, within the domain of extra-legal or non-legal constitutionalism? And in relationship to that, do you think that Douglas's assertions of constitutional citizenship alter the US Constitution independently of whether it prevails?
Thanks for the question, Wayne. I think this is a really interesting topic in terms of connecting Douglas's anti-slavery constitutionalism in the early 1850s to his political abolitionism. And I guess I have two thoughts. One really big picture thought, and then something a little in the weeds that might be interesting. So the big picture thought is that I think another way of thinking about Douglas's anti-slavery constitutionalism is that I think it's a kind of constitutionalism with a small c, as like some contemporary legal theorists will put it. So I think Douglas is primarily thinking about the Constitution, not as the legal document that we reinterpret, but rather as a set of practices of which that legal document is one manifestation or one element or one set of practices. But he's thinking of a wider variety of modes of social interaction as constitutional activity. It's the types of activities that make us a polity with some kind of common good that we attempt to pursue. So one big picture question is, I think, on my reading, because Douglas makes appeals to these like common sense interpretive principles, that really for Douglas, the idea isn't that he's trying to, he's not, for instance, I think an originalist. He'll say the true word of the exact or precise word of the Constitution is such and such. I think those moments are more misleading. And I tend to lean on the moments when he says, well, just think about like your common sense moral judgment and the practices that are guided by that judgment. Those are the things that should guide us in thinking about what we should value. Now, the other thing that's a little more in the weeds is that, and I have to credit Ian Zuckerman at Regis University. We were at WIPS, a political science conference recently, and he gave this really interesting paper on how Douglas, among others, developed an interpretation of like the insurrection clause in the Constitution as a mechanism for abolitionists to pursue political abolition. So Zuckerman argues that Douglas develops this view in the 1850s that the federal government is given the power to override other elements of the Constitution in order to put down insurrections. And Douglas's reading, and I'm oversimplifying a little here, but it illustrates the point. Douglas's reasoning is, well, okay, there's lots of slave insurrections that are occurring. This is part of what's at stake for Douglas in showing that resistance is ubiquitous in my bondage and my freedom. And so Douglas says that, well, if there's lots of insurrection that's occurring, one way in which the US could put down those slave insurrections would be to abolish slavery. And so Zuckerman shows all of these passages in which Douglas seems to be developing this claim that by leaning on the insurrection clause of the Constitution as invoking a certain kind of emergency powers, that there's this legal basis for abolishing slavery. And just the last thing that I'll say to connect it back to the first big picture point that I made is that I think that ultimately the way to interpret those kind of moves should be more like this small c constitutionalism, that it's this activity of trying to reshape our fundamental practices rather than primarily try to engage in technical legal interpretation. The thing that's going to abolish slavery on Zuckerman's reading of Douglas's use of the insurrectionary clause is this overriding of the non-state of emergency use of the Constitution. So really what's at stake for Douglas are the concrete forms of maybe extra legal, I think we might say, forms of interaction that we engage in, or legal interaction is only one small set of what counts as constitutional practices on my reading. But thanks for the question.
And one last question, and this is the discussion about Frederick Douglass and Republican citizenship and emancipatory politics was fascinating, so thank you. After hearing this talk, one book that comes to mind is Chris Bonner's Remaking the Republic, Black Politics and the Creation of American Citizenship. The author notes some Black activists who traveled to Europe came to imagine a citizenship status that, like freedom fighters around the Atlantic, is one community. For Bonner, these activists conceived of a citizenship comprised of people who challenged slavery and prejudice. So throughout the 1840s, Douglas traveled extensively, meeting with anti-slavery activists. And the question then is, to what extent did Douglas's experience in the wider Atlantic and knowledge of revolutionary Atlantic movements, from the French and Haitian revolutions to the Revolution of 1848, shape his ideas about political belonging?
Thanks, Shane. This is really helpful for me because earlier this year, I spent a while with an awesome research assistant of mine, shout out to Colleen Malley in the philosophy department, looking at Douglas's time in the British Isles. So for folks that don't know, Douglas publishes his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, when he's still a fugitive slave. And then in part because of the danger posed by publishing a book under his own name while he's a fugitive slave, flees to the British Isles for is about 2 years, a year and a half. He returns in 1848. And I spent a while over the past year trying to find moments in which Douglas might have been influenced by like British constitutional thought. So this also connects back to Wayne's question that it seems like one way of what I was calling small c constitutionalism would also be to think about like, well, the Constitution isn't primarily this written document, it's the set of practices or traditions. And so that might seem to like resonate with the way in which like the English think about their Constitution. And so I spent a while trying to find evidence of Douglas drawing on or engaging with that tradition of like English constitutional thought. And I didn't find anything for that year. But I think that the way that you're framing things, that maybe what Douglas is picking up on during his time in the British Isles is this wider conception of Republican citizenship that ultimately then manifests in like the revolutions of 48, might be a more fruitful way of thinking about how he's embedded in this Atlantic tradition of Republican political thought. So I think mostly, I don't have a direct answer for you. I think that mostly I just want to take this on board as a helpful way to sort of to reapproach that moment in Douglas's thought, because what I've done so far hasn't been productive. So thank you for that. That's really helpful.
Well, I want to thank you for providing us such an engaging discussion of your research. Thank you also to all of our attendees for joining the colloquium and for offering your comments and questions. And we will see you next time. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks so much. Take care.